How does race consciousness affect your work? Do you see yourself as a leader who advances issues of race or society or both? Is there a distinction? And is there such a thing as a race-transcending leader?
To the last question, no, there is not such a thing as a race-transcending leader. And if I've learned anything in the last year or two when I was working on this book I wrote, it's that there's no reason for there to be a race transcendence. The question I get this question a lot from audiences. Why do you even mention that the president is African American? They want to know. They don't understand why it matters. Didn't we just get past that? And my answer is always this: why does it bother you to talk about race unless you consider race to be a negative? If you consider race to be a positive, as I do, a wonderful characteristic which makes you who you are, which gives you a set of cultural norms and backgrounds, which doesn't make you, it's not a threat, it's not taking anything away from anybody else, it's just part of what shapes me. Why wouldn't we talk about it? Why wouldn't we talk about gender? Why wouldn't we talk about anything else? And to me, it would be enhancing if we as a nation and as a world, I guess, could talk about race in a way that wasn't about blame and redress and argument and guilt. That's what people are scared of when you bring up race. They're afraid you're going to accuse them of something, whether you're black and you're being accused of being insufficiently black, or whether you're white and you're being accused of being racist, whether you're Latino, whatever it is, race is a factor. And we should just embrace it as a factor, not everything of what we are.
Today's episode of Vocal Minority Report is brought to you by Audible.com. Go to audible.com/vocal report for your free audiobook download and 30-day free trial. They've got over 180,000 titles to choose from, so go to audible.com/vocal report and check them out. Hey, I'm recording this from my car today. We've got a great episode for you. It's been a crazy week. A lot has happened in the last 7 days since I voted, and we got screwed by the Electoral College once again. But we're working on some episodes regarding the post-election and the new Trump regime coming down the pike. But what we want to do is play a replay for you today of episode 13, Police Integrity Loss, from back in June. I hope you all enjoy this oldie but goodie. We'll holler at you after the show. Hey, welcome to another episode of the Vocal Minority Report. It's your boy, MC. Thanks so much for downloading. As always, you can download it any podcast in the world, but you're here with us. We still and always will appreciate that. Thanks to all our new listeners. I know after last week's show with Asia McClain Chapman from the Serial podcast, The Alibi Witness, and the Adnan Syed murder trial of Hayman Lee, I know we picked up a lot of new listeners, so thanks to everyone who listened. Thanks to everyone who left some positive comments. There were some positive comments, believe it or not, on Reddit, in addition to the negative ones, but it's all good. Thanks for everyone who's listening. Remember to use the hashtag The Vocal Minority. Please go to Facebook, like the page. It's facebook.com/The Vocal Minority Report. Leave a like there. Also go to iTunes, hit subscribe, leave a rating, leave a review. It will really help us. We really appreciate it. And if you're one of our valued SoundCloud listeners, please go on SoundCloud, like the show, repost. Go ahead and do it now. Take a minute, like, subscribe. I appreciate it. Thanks for everyone who's listening. And I hope you guys enjoy this episode. This week we have Phil Stinson, who is, I'll let him get into his backstory, but he is currently an associate professor and criminologist at Bowling Green State University. He's a fascinating man with a good story, but more importantly, the research that him and his team do on police misconduct is pretty fascinating and I think worthwhile to all of the audience. So in this episode, we'll talk about police misconduct, but not in the context of killing unarmed black people this time. This will be more about the broader issues of overall bad behavior and some of the items that might contribute to those killings and lack of the value of black lives and other minorities. So sit back, hope you enjoy the episode, and we'll talk to you after the show.
Previously on the Vocal Minority.
Are you part of the silent majority? Or are you part of the vocal minority?
Motherfuckers, go! Attention, please! Attention, please! If America can be saved, and I don't know if it's too late, but it'll be through a radio show like this new crime.
This shit here feels like the whole entire world collapse.
The revolution will not be televised, will not be televised, will not be televised, will not be televised. The revolution will be no rerun, brothers.
It's the vocal minority.
The revolution will be live.
Welcome to the Vocal Minority Report. Our guest today is a former police officer who is now an associate professor of criminal justice at Bowling Green State University, where he's a pioneer in the research and collection of data on police crime and misconduct. He manages the largest police conduct database in America. His work has been featured on Nate Silver's website, 538.com, as well as cited in the Washington Post. He's been a guest on Anderson Cooper 360, CBS This Morning. He's also hosted the great podcast, Police Integrity Lost. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Phil Stinson to the show.
Oh, thanks for having me. Looking forward to it.
Hey, no problem. Thanks for being here. Really a pleasure to have you with us. As I told you before we started recording, I'm a big fan of your podcast, which is, it's kind of weird to say I'm a big fan of a podcast about police misconduct, but the way you get that information out to the listeners, a big fan of. And the topic is one that interests me greatly. You know, when the people who are supposed to protect us, you know, who's policing them? You know, it's kind of cliche, but, you know, that's certainly an interesting topic. So,
nobody's policing them because law enforcement is generally exempt from law enforcement.
Okay.
So that's one of the reasons I got into this area of research to begin with, because it's a hidden crime. And as a graduate student, you know, thinking about what you're going to do for a dissertation topic, it fascinated me that there's no official statistics available. There's very little research, and nobody's got good data. At least at that time, nobody had good data in this area. So something that I was really drawn to. And I tell you what really interests me the most, which is impossible to really study, are the police officers who commit crimes and they don't get caught. That's where the real interest is. But I haven't figured out how to conquer that area of research yet.
One area you have conquered is the collection, and I guess we should speak about the data we're speaking of, as far as your database and what you've collected and what you actually do. Okay,
we can go into that. So I started this back at the end of 2004, and I had practiced law for about a decade and gone back to graduate school, and was in a graduate class where we were dealing with these types of issues. And, you know, classmates of mine didn't think that police officers got in trouble much. And I just thought that was a ridiculous notion, and that it seemed to happen with some regularity. And what I decided to do at that point was to rely on media reports, so news articles. And, you know, when people look at their local newspaper wherever they happen to live and read an article of an officer who's gotten in trouble, I think the general reaction is, wow, that's kind of weird. That doesn't happen very much. And what they don't realize is that people in every town and city across the country are reading similar articles every week. Right. So over time, I developed about 50 automated search terms. We set up Google alerts, and they constantly crawl the Google News search engine. And I've been doing this since the beginning of 2005. So initially, the way we find out about officers who get arrested are news reports, and we follow the cases through the court system. We get the court records when they're available, and anything else that we can get hold of. And we do this about 1,100 times a year. So at this point, there's over 10,000 officers in our database, and about almost 12,000 arrest cases, because some of the officers get arrested more than once. Some of them have more than one victim, and we look at the criminal case outcomes, so we separate those out into different cases. So that's what we've been doing, and you know, it started out as something that was all on paper, and we've long since gone away from that. So we have an object relational database. So it has a digital imaging database component, it has a video database, it has a relational database component. All these things are put together, and then ultimately I have a staff of research assistants who are students here at Bowling Green, and they code the content of all the data, all the raw data that we have, all the news articles, the court records, those kinds of things for every arrest case. So while we're logging in arrest cases for 2016 right now, another group of students are actually going back and coding the 2012 arrest cases on about 270 quantitative variables. So we have a computerized coding instrument, and then ultimately we'll do analyses, and we'll add that to our data set of 2005 through 2011. And the reason there's a lag of several years is that because we are interested in the criminal case outcomes, we're interested in the final adverse employment outcomes, those kinds of things. We got to give it some time to work through the court system.
Gotcha.
And that sort of thing. Yeah. So it's interesting. It's a lot of work.
That right there, it sounds, I mean, it's pretty amazing, actually, your description of it. I mean, a lot of what you said is over my head as far as how you guys collect the data, but the data that you get and the results that it yields is fascinating and certainly something that was needed. And as you noted, was lacking, for years and years. And it's good to know that that level of thought and research is going into finding these numbers. So that data is true and accurate, because I've heard you mention this beforehand. Unless you guys are doing this, then who else is telling the public what is really going on? And like you said, those cases that are outside of our local areas that we live in. One thing that I feel, and you probably run into this to a lot, I would assume in your work, is that, when we talk about what the police are doing, a lot of people think it's cop bashing, right? And I always say, well, isn't it just accountability and accurate, and I guess for you, accurately reporting on those who we trust when shit goes bad? I mean, that's
right. Exactly. A lot of people assume that somehow the work that I do is anti-police, that I'm anti-law enforcement, and I really don't look at it that way at all. I look at this, I'm a criminologist, that's what my PhD's in, and I look at this as life course criminology, that we're looking at the work I do now. It's a longitudinal trend study, and we're looking at patterns over time, but we're also looking at patterns and analyzing data over the course of individuals' careers. So I'll give you an example of something that identified fairly early on in the research, and this is held true every time we go back and look at the more current numbers. Prior research from back in the 1960s and 70s would suggest that if an officer is going to get in trouble, they're going to do so pretty early in their career. In other words, there's a whole socialization process when someone becomes a police officer. They go to the academy, they have a field training officer after that, and then they get on the street by themselves. And generally, if an officer is going to get in trouble and wash out, it's going to be within the first 3 to 5 years. So if somebody gets to about year 7 in their employment as a sworn law enforcement officer, the prior research really assumed that they just sort of ride out their careers, and they just kind of like delinquents age out and police officers age out, bad cops age out is what they were looking at. So what I found, though, is something different. I think the reason that we were the first to find this was nobody else has had this type of data. So what we found is about 20% of the officers who were arrested each year are arrested within 3 years of their being eligible for retirement from the police department. So we see these jumps, we see these spikes at 18 to 20 years, 23 to 25, 28 to 30, and even 33 to 35 years of service. And it to this day, it just blows me away, because it's really hard to sort of figure out what's going on. If somebody's been a law enforcement officer that long, how is it possible that they're getting in trouble at that stage? Have they been getting in trouble all along? Is this something new? And I think several things are going on. I think one of the issues is it's very difficult for somebody to lose that persona as a police officer. They've got the gun and the badge, and those are really heavy things. And I think that a lot of people have difficulty going back to a non-law enforcement position. In other words, having to commingle with their neighbors without doing so under the background of having a badge and a gun. And I think that's a difficult thing for some people, that transition.
I'm glad you mentioned that, because that's one of the things I want to talk about, because I think that kind of relates to your research on domestic violence and as far as in domestic, even in your neighborhood, and not being able to turn that switch off. I think you mentioned, so even, you just talked about post-career, but even while they're still on duty and active, there appears to be, at least research shows, that turning that switch off is hard. So when they have that mentality, they get into a lot of domestic issues, involving partners or neighbors or things that,
Yep. Absolutely. So officer-involved domestic violence is a huge problem, and it's something that until about 15 years ago really wasn't looked at very closely. And a few things happened that turned that around. One is the police chief in Tacoma, Washington in the early 2000s was named David Brame, and he ended up in 2003, I believe, shooting and killing his wife and then shooting and killing himself in the presence of his young children. And in the wake of Brame's murder-suicide, there was an investigation that looked into, how did we get to this point? And there were some really troubling things that had come up. One thing that came up was that when he was hired as a young police officer, there were recommendations from more than one police psychologist saying, do not hire this guy. We've evaluated him, and he is not fit to be an officer. There were allegations of rape that were made by one or more women during his career, and those were completely discounted.
Wow.
And there were ongoing problems when he broke up with his wife with domestic violence that just, was ignored. So, yeah, we've done some research in this area with officer-involved domestic violence, and as you pointed out, it's really difficult for some officers to turn it off when they go home. So policing is violent. They deal with all kinds of violent things in the course of their job. And it seems that some officers have great difficulties in turning that off and just being a husband or a boyfriend or a girlfriend or a dad or a mom,
Right.
When they go home. So, there are all sorts of issues here with officer-involved domestic violence that are huge problems. For example, if you're the victim of officer-involved domestic violence, who do you call? If you live in the area where your significant other is employed by the local police department, you may be very reluctant to call that agency because ultimately you've got dual concerns here. One is you've got to stop the abuse. The other thing, though, is you got to hopefully do that in a way that somebody doesn't lose their job, because you've got child support, all kinds of things to think about. But here's the kicker. There's a federal law. It's called the Lautenberg Amendment to the Federal Gun Control Act of 1968. And under that, someone who has been convicted of what they call a qualifying misdemeanor crime of domestic violence cannot own or possess firearms or ammunition. And there's no exemption for military or law enforcement officers once they've been convicted. So it's a huge problem. And we see strange things happen where officers are actually charged with the wrong offense when they should have been charged with simple assault or felony assault for domestic problems. And instead they're charged with something that's seemingly inappropriate. And it's to get past that, because if they get convicted of that domestic violence charge, they're done.
Right. Okay. Yeah. Okay. And then that makes sense. They'll just they'll cut them off, so they'll change the charge. Wow.
Yep.
So, do you think that is to protect the municipality and to protect the officer, and also to protect that municipality and the police force for that area, or is it twofold there?
Yeah, it's all of the above, because cops like to protect each other. There's a strong police subculture. They try not to turn on each other, those kinds of things. So you've got that sort of thing. You've got the concerns of somebody losing their livelihood, and then law enforcement agencies don't like this negative attention once it gets out into the press. And it really is an interesting thing, because if you think of it, if you're an accountant, if you're a salesperson, if you're a firefighter or a plumber, you're not going to lose your livelihood because you're convicted of a simple assault charge, but you are as a law enforcement officer. There's a lot at stake here. Right.
So I was about to say, so there's almost some practicality in doing it, but I feel terrible saying, there's no practicality, and obviously, excusing or trying to cover up domestic violence, but from a practical nature, as far as protecting the livelihood and the things you mentioned, I can see why the incentive lies there for those people. So staying on the whole domestic violence thing, and am I right to couple, when domestic violence generally means in the home, spouses or partners,
and kids, children too,
and kids. But when it's done outside of the home and in the neighborhood or just in the everyday walk of life. I think you mentioned on another interview I heard where, sometimes it's just committing crimes for sport, like just fucking with people. Like, so.
Yeah.
And to me, those kind of all go into that same, not turn off the switch, having that level of authority and knowing that you could get away with it, or more than likely, depending on what it is. Maybe we should go back and tell people a little bit more about your background. I mentioned that you were a former police officer, but when we talk about what cops are doing and how they may feel, you've got special insight to that, having been a former police officer. So let's circle back and talk about your trajectory from from dispatcher initially when you were in college, and then to your research now. So let's talk about how you made that transition, how you ended up here.
All right. Well, I went to college in Virginia at George Mason University, right outside of Washington, D.C. And while I was in college, I was a police dispatcher with the Arlington County Police Department, which is just across the Potomac River from Washington, D.C. And from there, when I graduated from college, I wanted to go to northern New England. So I moved to New Hampshire, became a police officer in Dover, New Hampshire. One of the reasons why I moved to New Hampshire, other than my girlfriend lived in New Hampshire at the time.
That's a good reason.
It was at the time, yeah. One of the reasons was all full-time police officers in the state of New Hampshire go to the New Hampshire State Police Academy. Everybody gets the same training. It's phenomenal training. They have a statewide retirement system. You could actually move around from agency one to another in the agency. And there was a lot that I liked about it. I liked the agency I worked at. At the time, there were 40 or 50 sworn officers in that department. I think it's bigger now, but it was about that size when I was there. And one of the things that I really liked about the agency was that they had a case management system where, unless it was a drug case or certain juvenile cases, most of the follow-up investigations came back to the patrol officer, and we really did a lot of detective work as patrol officers and got a lot of good criminal investigation experience as a young police officer. And I think that was important. And I spent several years up there and decided that I wanted to go to law school. So I went back to Washington, D.C., worked at a law firm, and then went to law school and practiced law for about 10 years. While I was in law school, I worked as a counselor at a juvenile detention center in Fairfax County, Virginia. I've done criminal defense work as an attorney, all kinds of different things. And then ultimately, I really sort of imploded professionally and personally and decided I'd live a lot longer if I wasn't a litigator. So decided to go back to school because I wanted to become a university professor. And to do that, I needed a PhD. And to get into a PhD program, I needed a master's degree. So that was a rather lengthy process. And then in 2009, I finished up my dissertation, earned the PhD, and then came to Bowling Green at that point.
That's an interesting life. That's a lot. That's a lot of different things in this time. So, I've heard you say that you saw some shit that really opened your eyes while a police officer in New Hampshire. And immediately I think, geez, what could he have seen in New Hampshire, like on the mean streets of New Hampshire? But
that's what I thought when I moved there too. I thought, well, this is going to be pretty quiet, and a lot of things blew me away immediately up there. One of the things that really I guess I never thought about before. I had, as a child, my family vacationed in northern New Hampshire many summers, and I was used to, some of the more rural areas of the state. And I guess I'd never really thought about the fact that there were public housing projects in, cities in New Hampshire where I ultimately worked. And, I did a lot of work with kids in public housing, and I wasn't expecting that in that, in that area of New Hampshire. So, there were all sorts of things that I saw over time that were just not what I was expecting. And quite honestly, they were very different experiences of what I witnessed as an auxiliary police officer and a dispatcher in Arlington, Virginia. I saw things in New Hampshire that just blew me away. So I'll give you some examples. So one of the things I saw was that there were a few people in the agency that I worked for, one specifically, who was hell-bent on the good guys always winning, and it didn't matter how we won. The bottom line was, at the end of the day, the good guys are ahead. And the problem with that is it just fundamentally is unconstitutional, but it's just morally wrong to nail something on somebody when when they're not the bad guy that committed that crime, even though we know they're committing like crimes, that sort of thing.
Okay.
And I was involved in a case that went all the way up to the New Hampshire Supreme Court that dealt with an out-of-court identification that had been rigged so that it was overly suggestive and that a victim would point to a certain guy as the rapist when in fact he could not have been the rapist in that case. So things like that. And I saw instances where...
I'm sorry. Which case was that? There's a podcast called Crime Writers On that's based out of New Hampshire, and I'm just curious. I know some of them listen to this show. Which case was that you cited?
That case is called State versus Fecteau, Fecteau. And the defendant in that case was named Gary Fecteau, and he went to prison for many, many years. And he was a bad dude, but he and I arrested Fecteau for attacking a young lady. He picked the wrong young lady to attack. She was on her way with her father that day to some sort of regional judo championship, and it was just the wrong young lady to pick. But the crimes that they wanted to pin on him, which were just a little bit different, and they could not have, for a variety of reasons, could not have been Fecteau. But that's the case that I was referring to, and I only mention his name because it is a published court opinion, and it's a matter of public record.
I appreciate that. Like I said, I just as a point of reference, I'm just curious if that's a case that they may have mentioned or had some familiarity with. All right, so
the other thing I saw up in New Hampshire that blew me away was where there was a lot of street justice where officers would just beat the shit out of somebody for the sport of it and to teach somebody a lesson.
Right.
And I had not witnessed that type of thing before, hadn't been involved in that type of thing, and it really was an eye-opener. And frankly, my experiences up there, I think, really have had a lot to do with the course I've taken in life. Fundamental due process is just really important to me, and I think a lot of that comes from my time working as a police officer in New Hampshire. Okay.
All right. And then also you mentioned the good training and the kind of universal training they have up there. And is that where you heard the three things that will really screw up a cop in their career?
Yeah, that's right. I was at the State Police Academy in Concord, New Hampshire, and it was almost 30 years ago, actually. I'm 51 years old now, and I was 21 at the time. So it's loosely stated, booze, broads, and bills. So in other words, alcohol-related problems, women-related problems, and money-related problems. Those are the three things that are going to screw you up as a cop. They're going to mess up your career and mess you up. And I think there's a lot of truth to that, actually.
Right.
And, it's interesting. Anecdotally, I can tell you that a surprisingly large number of the officers that get arrested for a variety of types of crimes have filed for bankruptcy. And we know that because we went back and actually ran all the names of 7 years of officers that had been arrested, 5,545, through the federal court's PACER system, the Public Access to Courts Electronic Record System, to find out if and when they had ever been civilly sued in federal court for violating somebody's civil rights during the course of their law enforcement career. And, there again we found close to 20% of these officers had been sued in federal court at some point in their career. But we also saw a lot of these officers had serious money problems, had filed for bankruptcy. We can see some patterns too mid-career. Between 9 and 12 years of service, we're aware that many officers that get in trouble seem to be having divorce problems around that time.
Okay.
So that's the women. Then we got the money problems, and then the alcohol problems. So one of the things that I wanted to study, and we did this a number of years ago, I was really interested in studying drunk driving and police officers, because when I was a police officer, it was the general unwritten policy, the unwritten rule, that you'd always help an officer out and you would do everything you could to not arrest them. And remember, I said law enforcement is exempt from law enforcement.
Right.
And that's especially true historically in drunk driving cases. So we had, I think it was 782 cases over a 5-year period of drunk driving arrest cases. And we wanted to know, all right, what is it about these cases that led these officers to be arrested when we know that most officers who get caught driving drunk are not criminally charged? And what we found was that typically those were cases where something just really sort of weird happened, something that you could not explain without having to call a tow truck and spend money or write up a report.
Okay.
So if a
like
police officer,
last resort stuff.
Yeah, well, if a police officer drives into a fire truck or a fire hydrant or a fire station or another police car or flips their car over into a ditch, takes out a row of mailboxes, those kinds of things. We saw that over and over. I've never seen so many flipped cars in my life. So those kinds of things led to officers being charged. And then another thing that was really sort of strange, over 15% of the officers who were arrested for drunk driving were also charged with hit and run. They fled the scene of an accident while they were drunk. And the reason they do that is because they know better than anybody, if they cannot get caught until they sober up, they're not going to get the DUI charge.
Right. Yeah. Because there's the blood alcohol level will
Right.
decrease and it'll be out of their system. Okay.
Right. But this is a bad idea, and I do not recommend fleeing the scene from an accident, because all it does is aggravate the problem. It makes it worse, and ultimately lands them in a lot more trouble where they're frankly more likely to end up losing their job.
And this whole alcohol culture of police, it's certainly dramatized a lot. And I've always wondered, and TV is not reality, but it certainly spun from some level of truth. Long day in the office, a long day chasing bad guys. Everyone goes to the local pub, bar, whatever, gets shit faced. And then I'm like, well, how do they get home?
Right.
And so I guess obviously that happens a lot in real life and is really an issue.
Well, what's weird is when you mix the alcohol and firearms. So there was a professor named Jim Fife who passed away more than a decade ago, and he coined the phrase bizarre violence when referring to off-duty officers and the crazy shit they do with firearms, with guns. So you mentioned bars. We have more than a handful of cases where off-duty officers sitting at a bar pull out their gun and brandish it, point it at somebody else. A normal bar dispute, let's say you and I get in a dispute over the Cowboys versus the Redskins or something like that. For some reason with these guys, it leads to pulling out a gun. It's just crazy. I mean, who does that kind of thing? Nobody but drunk cops.
It's the same thing, that level of power and entitlement. That's the word. Yeah.
And power. Guns and a badge equal an amazing amount of power that can be misused.
Yeah, and I think most of us have experienced that in our lives, even when just getting pulled over, where it's like, dude, why don't you relax a little bit, or in certain interactions. So another thing that seems to be pretty prevalent with cops is when they do go off the rails, if you will, or they're really heavy in the domestic violence. Isn't them killing themselves? You mentioned in Washington with the police officer there killing his wife and then killing himself. It seems like I hear about, and I guess there's a decent number of murder suicides, independent of being police officers. But is the suicide of police officers or them committing or shooting themselves in those instances, is that pretty common too?
Yeah, unfortunately, we do see a fair amount of suicides with officers who get in trouble, and it's an unfortunate thing, and it's an interesting thing. So we see this, well, frankly, far too often, where an officer is about to be arrested and kills himself. And the reason we talk about it in my research group is we have a case inclusion criteria that they actually have to be charged or arrested before we include them in the database. So we actually had a case, I think it was in Northport, Florida, where an officer knew that the knocking on the door was other police officers coming to arrest them, and the officer killed themselves before they actually accomplish the arrest. So we did not include that case in our case inclusion criteria. So you use the term coming off the rails. One of the things that we've seen, and we see this where officers get in trouble over a period of time and get arrested multiple times, is that it's a complete unraveling where we can sit here in Bowling Green, Ohio, in my research lab and look at a case or look at an individual and say, you know what, that's the third time that dude has been arrested for drunk driving in the last 12 months, and the second time they're arrested for domestic violence. Somebody needs to intervene. And we had a case just like that about 2 years ago where it was an officer in the Cleveland area in Ohio where about a day after I had mentioned that to one of my research assistants, the officer killed himself. And the student said to me, why didn't you do something about that? And I said, well, whoa, wait a minute. We're researchers. We're not working out in the field. We're not clinicians. That's not our job. But the point is, if we can recognize that somebody's completely unraveling,
right, the
signs are all there. Why are they ignoring it? And I can tell you the answer to that is when the Justice Department comes into an agency and mandates they make changes because of civil rights problems and things like that, one of the things that they typically require is implementation of something called an early warning system or an early intervention system. And it's basically a flagging system where they track all sorts of data on officer conduct and misconduct. So the number of complaints, the number of traffic accidents, the number of sick days, a number of arrests, all these different kinds of things. And the idea is to intervene if somebody is prone to having problems or they're heading down the wrong way before it escalates and it's too late.
Right.
And what the research has shown in that area is that the agencies, even when they have these early warning systems, they ignore all the flags, they ignore all the bells that go off, and they simply ignore it. And that's what seems to be going on with these officers who have completely gone off the rails. They're completely unraveling professionally, personally. Everything's coming to a head. It's a problem, and that's one area that I'm hoping that my research, can get more into that area where we're able to try to come up with some, use all this data to try to figure out what can we do to change the way that agencies operate to help officers before it's too late, whether it's suicide or whether it's, arrest for a felony, whatever the problem is, or misdemeanor, frankly. Cops shouldn't be getting arrested.
Right.
Something needs to change. And I guess I should point out, we deal with outliers. Only a fraction of 1% of the officers in most departments ever get arrested. It seems like a lot when we're talking about we have over 10,000 in our database over the last 11 or 12 years.
Right.
But it's not a large number. And keep in mind, the only ones who get in our database are ones who've actually been arrested.
Right. Yeah. And well, that's an important distinction. Yeah. We're not certainly talking about, I know some of our listenership are police officers, and we all know you. We're not talking about everybody, but in light of everything that's happened, since post Ferguson now, it's important that these conversations are highlighted, so things can be done preventative, and the light can be shined on a lot of these reports that come out about these officers. There was something funny in their personnel file. Oh, maybe whatever. There's sometimes these warning signs as we discuss. So it's important that we highlight these items. You mentioned your data from 2005 to 2011. I've got these numbers from you where, let's see, 6,724 arrests involving 5,545 individual sworn officers in over 2,500 agencies in 1,200 counties or independent cities in all 50 states, right? So that's kind of the data we're talking about. So when you hear those numbers, when you talk about that 1%, I mean, it's still a small number, but those numbers still seem sort of staggering.
Well, they are staggering. And I think the reason it's so important and it's so surprising when you look at those numbers is that there's no other research that I'm aware of that has looked at so many agencies at police misconduct. We're looking at over 2,500 agencies. That's a lot of different places,
right?
All across the country. Urban areas, suburban, rural. It's a lot of cases, and again, we're adding about 1,000 to 1,100 new arrest cases each year.
And with those arrests, your research also shows that a lot of those end up in them being fired, and not being fired, I should say. Like, and I guess, and to relay that to like on-duty shootings, I've got some numbers here where 54 officers arrested, 11 convicted. There were 19 cases pending at the time when you were reporting this, and all others were found not guilty or cases dropped. So in the event of an on-duty shooting,
you're talking about shootings where somebody's charged with murder or manslaughter. So right now the numbers are up. So we've got as of today, if we go back to the beginning of 2005, I believe it's 70 officers have been charged with murder or manslaughter resulting from an on-duty shooting.
Okay.
And 23 of those officers, so about 38%, if my math is right, were convicted.
Okay, so I'll update these.
A lot
numbers.
of those cases are still pending, but it's very difficult for a court, for a prosecutor to get a conviction in those types of cases. But I want to go back to something that you had just said. So, in terms of officers that are fired, when I started this research, I had the assumption that if an officer was arrested for anything, that was it. They were done. They were gone. They were fired, and that's not the case. And there are some differences from state to state. So if a state is a right to work state, in other words, if it's a state that does not have collective bargaining in the public sector,
right?
Those officers, I think Texas may well be in that category.
We are, yes.
Yeah. So in those states, an officer is likely to get fired immediately after an incident comes to light or an officer is arrested or charged. In South Carolina, before the sun comes up the next morning, they're fired. Okay. And that's typically the way it is for police officers in those types of states. And then on the other hand, if you've got agencies like the Philadelphia Police Department that's in a state that allows for police collective bargaining, it is damn near impossible for the Philadelphia Police Department to successfully terminate an officer's employment as a result of being arrested. It's very, very difficult, and sometimes it doesn't even happen when they've been convicted, so long as it's a misdemeanor they've been convicted of. But it does blow me away that there are cops out there who've been convicted of misdemeanors relating to their jobs, and they're still out there working as police officers. And I didn't realize that happened. So, and by the way, we see in the states where it's a right to work state where an officer is quickly terminated, in those states, for many types of the criminal offenses for which they're charged, the officers are less likely to be convicted. And it seems to be that the courts are saying, well, look, he or she's already been punished enough. They've already lost their job. Okay. Do we really need to go through with this? And the charges get dropped, or they get, reduced to a fairly minor offense, and then there's a plea bargain. So we do see some of these patterns. But yeah, not all of them are fired. Sometimes, officers, and this is not in my database because they weren't actually charged, but this really does interest me. Sometimes officers are given the option of quietly resigning in lieu of criminal charges being initiated. Okay. And there's several reasons for that. One is agencies don't like airing their dirty laundry. They don't like things becoming public. So if they can handle something quietly, they're going to do so. Another reason that seems to come in play, every cop in this country knows something called their Garrity rights. So there's a case from the 1960s, a U.S. Supreme Court case called Garrity versus New Jersey. And the holding of that case is that a law enforcement agency, in questioning an officer about a potential crime, can require that the officer answer the questions or lose their job. But if they do that, that's a coerced statement that cannot then be used against the officer criminally. Okay. So you come into that sometimes with officers who are actually allowed to resign or terminated in lieu of charges being brought. The way you'd successfully prosecute a case like this is you'd have to build your case without that statement that was obtained in a coerced fashion. That's all there is to it, but that just doesn't seem to happen sometimes.
Right, because there's a reluctancy to pursue those on that level, as we discussed. Okay. So another thing I wanted to talk about was sexual misconduct, if we're talking about things that happened in your research. Because one thing that really stood out to me was over 50% of the victims of police sexual misconduct are juveniles, right?
Yeah, it's really quite troubling. So there are several things there. It's really alarming when on a daily basis in my work and my research group, we see cases where, my research assistants will tell me the facts of a case, and I'll say, oh, that involved a 15-year-old girl and a cop, right? And it's really strange. I mean, we can really see these patterns. So there's several things going on. And by the way, boys are sexually victimized by some, rogue police officers as well as girls. So we're talking about predators there. We're not talking about your average cop. We're talking about sexual predators who are criminals who happen to have a gun and a badge.
Right. And you mentioned that 15-year-old thing. That's the sweet spot somewhat for, and that sounds bad to say sweet spot, we're talking about predators, but for both boys and girls, being 15 right. is that number just so happens to be, right?
Yeah. And there are several things. One is, I think at age 14 or 15, kids are more likely to be out without so much parental supervision. That may have something to do with it.
Right.
We also see something going on where it seems that officers, both on duty and off duty, have access to kids, teenagers and younger, in situations where their caregivers let their guard down that perhaps they wouldn't. If the new boyfriend was, I don't know, a landscaper, a plumber, a librarian, maybe mom, wouldn't leave her 15-year-old daughter and her 12-year-old daughter alone with him. But since he's, a police officer, well, that's not a problem. We're just going to send the 12-year-old and the 15-year-old over to his house for the weekend while I work or whatever.
Right, right. Okay.
Those are strange situations, but we see a lot of that. And yeah, it's about 50% of the cases the victims are under the age of 18 when we're dealing with officers who are charged with sex offenses. So that's a huge problem. And some of the stuff is just it's just unreal. Officers who are using a police department computer to go online and solicit what they think is a 13-year-old girl or a 14-year-old girl. I mean, it's bad enough that people think they can get away with that kind of thing, but who the hell would do that on their work computer, let alone if they're a police officer?
Right,
I mean, it's just absolutely nuts. So, another thing that we see that's troubling with, again, we're dealing with a very small number of predator police officers here, we see a pattern with some officers who sexually victimize women who they view as throwaways, women who are on the fringe, sex workers, prostitutes, strippers, homeless women, that sort of thing,
right, okay.
Where they don't think they're going to be believed if they come forward. That's what Daniel Hoseclaw, who is an Oklahoma City police officer,
thought.
The
serial, right. And he was killing the black women or the...
Exactly. Almost all of his victims were women of color, and most of them were older than you would typically think the victims would be. It was a very strange case, and thankfully, one of the women who he thought that one of the women was just a throwaway, and what he did not realize, this was a fairly young grandmother who had no criminal record and had a good job, and when she came forward, she was immediately believed, and that really started the ball rolling in this whole investigation with Holesclaw. And as you probably know, he's been sentenced to more than 260 years in prison for the various crimes for which he was convicted fairly recently. So he is a really troubled guy. That's a nasty, nasty case. And you got to wonder how many women were victimized that did not come forward. We do see a pattern, and I saw this initially in cases out of Southern California years ago. So when you have a woman who's finally believed and criminal charges are brought, let's say for an officer who rapes them, and we're talking about on-duty cases here.
Right.
As soon as it gets into the news that this happened, that the officer was arrested because you have this victim, there's, for every one victim initially, there's 5 more.
Okay.
There's 5 more, and they end up coming forward. And frankly, it's a strange, I don't know if anybody else has recognized this pattern before, but we actually saw the exact same pattern with Jerry Sandusky, the former assistant football coach at Penn State,
Right.
who was molesting young boys. Same kind of thing, where there was 5 to every 1 that initially had been believed.
Wow. Yeah. Well, I mean, it's kind of like that Bill Cosby thing, and I don't know if those numbers are accurate too, but people say those numbers are larger too. So, wow. Okay. That Holtzclaw, I want to do a whole show dedicated to telling that story, just because it is so interesting. And I don't know that it got the media attention. I don't know if it's because it's Oklahoma or because it's women of color, or maybe there was so many other things going on in that news cycle, but I don't feel like it got the level of attention media wise that it needed to.
A lot of people think that it did not get the media attention that it should have. And I will tell you that we have more news articles in our database about Daniel Holtzclaw than any of the other almost 11,000 officers in our database. But here's the thing. I think that the press, and especially the national press, was slow to report on that case. And the problem there is the reason they were slow to report on that case because the victims were black women.
Oh, right.
And that's the problem there. And I think it's something that's I don't know the answer, but I think there's something there, and I think that it's something that the media should really think about. Okay,
well, I certainly agree. When I do this episode, I'm going to get with you and get more of your research, because I do want to tell that story, both as information, as a cautionary tale too, to shed light on kind of what's going on. So, all right, well, that's sad. I'm saddened to know that it wasn't reported by the media because they were black women, more than likely, but it's certainly not unexpected. So I guess that's kind of where we are, unfortunately. All right, so I have one other topic I wanted to get on with you, and that was school resource officers. Because obviously as things change, in my lifetime, that wasn't something that was real prevalent, I think, when I was a kid, maybe in inner cities or different areas, but growing up in the suburbs, we didn't have them. I guess as I got to high school, there was an officer there. I think there may have been an officer in my later years of high school, but
I don't know if they called it a school resource officer back then.
Yeah, I don't think so either. I don't know that. I don't think so. The effect and the role that they played now versus what they did back then, I think has changed, in 20 years or so. What was it? 20 plus years has changed a great deal, right?
Yeah. Well, there's several things with the school resource officers who get in trouble. So, and by the way, the school resource officers that we see getting in trouble, they typically get in trouble for cases that you'd more likely see a high school teacher get arrested for. So sex crimes involving kids that they came to know through the course of their employment at the high school or the junior high. So there's 2 important things to consider here with the school resource officers. One is these officers who are placed in the schools, and quite often they work for sheriff's offices, but they can work for other agencies as well. And where you are in Texas, you've got a lot of independent school districts that have their own police departments, those kinds of things. So the officers are generally not educators. They're not people who have gone to college to become a high school teacher and gotten licensed or certified in the state as an educator. They don't have the same training and background as other people do who work in our public schools. So that's one thing to consider. Another thing is there's a problem with role ambiguity. What is it that the school resource officer is supposed to be doing in the school? Are they security? Are they a counselor? Are they an investigator? What is their role? And that's not clearly defined in a lot of places. There's a lot of confusion about that. And because there's confusion and role ambiguity, there are problems as to their training and their in-service training, because if we don't know what they're there to do to begin with, it's hard to figure out what to do in the way of training and in-service training. So we got a lot of problems there. And frankly, I think that in many instances we have school resource officers just because parents and school board members and teachers want to have somebody there if the worst case scenario erupts where you've got an active shooter in a school. But I will tell you this, I remember as a young police officer thinking it would be kind of cool to work in the local high school, but I think it's a bad idea generally to have police officers always in our public schools. And the reason for that is I think that kids who get in trouble at school, their behavior becomes criminalized. They're charged as a delinquent or as an adult, when before it was just a school discipline problem. When I was a lawyer, I represented a lot of kids in school discipline cases, kids who had been expelled from public schools or, that type of thing. And now what we're seeing is these cases are quick to get into the court system when, in fact, there are a lot of cases that would have been handled informally, would never have had law enforcement involvement. So I think that's a huge problem. And because of all the issues we just talked about with role ambiguity and lack of training, lack of education, lack of supervision is another one.
Right.
I think this is something that people need to spend a lot of time thinking about. Do we really want cops in our schools? And if so, what are they there for? That type of thing.
Yeah, because like you said, with the role ambiguity, and there's been stories here in the Dallas area, all over the country, where the principal is sort of taken out of the equation, because the police officer certainly is not going to acquiesce to the principal if there's something that they deem criminal. Whereas, back in the day, the principal would, they'd expel the student or suspend the student or whatever, or it might die there. But now, like you said, the kid is picking up a charge. And then that is a whole nother can of worms, because the juvenile system where the judge is making those decisions, there is no jury, when you're putting, you're creating what could be a fast track to the criminal system.
It is a fast track.
For things that are simple, little small things that we all either did or experienced when we were kids. And that doesn't make certain things okay. But, having a record for, I can't even think of some little asinine thing, but a lot of things.
Simple assault. It could be having some sort of a weapons offense because they had their Boy Scout knife that they have the little kids, third grader, who had his Cub Scout knife that was in his book bag because they went on a camping trip with his Cub Scout pack the weekend before, hands it to the teacher as soon as they realize, oh my gosh, I've got my pocket knife with me. And then instead of just quietly taking the knife from the kid, now that's zero tolerance, and you got the third grader who's being arrested for having a dangerous weapon in his school. It's nuts.
Yeah, no, it definitely is nuts. Where do you think your research on that and everything is headed? Do you think that, obviously, your position as a researcher is to research, gather that data, to distribute that out, but as a researcher, is there a goal?
Well, I think that if you look at this on many levels, one goal was to get a job and earn tenure and get promoted and things like that.
Well, of course.
So that we got those kinds of goals. But with this research, I am very interested in, again, I go back to life course criminology and looking at, the trajectory across individuals' careers and looking at patterns and trying to figure out ways to reduce these types of problems for individuals and for agencies going forward. So that's the kind of thing that I'm hoping to focus on in the years ahead. Think about what sort of policy implications are there, what sort of training implications are there. Those are concerns that I think flow out of this research. One of the things that's important is to get the research out of the academic journals that nobody has access to and nobody reads, but I'm required to publish in order to have gotten tenure and promoted and all that stuff, which is, by the way, one of the reasons the only reason we started the Police Integrity Laws podcast was because the condition of our grant from the National Institute of Justice at the U.S. Department of Justice was that we have some products that result from the grant that are non-scholarly, that are practitioner-oriented. So we did that as a way of just getting this stuff out there so that people would be able to access this without, finding their way to an obscure journal somewhere.
Okay, well, that's good. I'm glad the grant called for that and you guys had wherewithal to put that out there. It's really informative. There's a lot of episodes, a lot of information that you put out. A lot of your talks and interviews are featured there. So I recommend that everyone check out the podcast there. And I definitely appreciate your time this morning. Is there anything you think we haven't covered, or anything that's real important in your research that is important to get out to our listeners before we wrap up?
Well, I think the one area we haven't talked about is drug crimes involving officers. So we looked at several different things with drug crimes. One is we're interested in the corruption-related things, the shakedowns, people who are being robbed by rogue police officers, those kinds of things that are drug-related types of crimes committed by officers. But the other thing is we were interested in looking at beyond that into looking at what are the drugs of abuse of choice of law enforcement officers. And we found that the drug of choice, no matter the crime, whether it's personal use, whether it's dealing, whether it's stealing, whether it's, whatever it is cocaine.
Okay.
It's cocaine, marijuana, crack, and then heroin.
Really? Okay.
In that order. And there is probably what we see in the general public is the patterns that we'll see with officers. We've seen a shift to heroin from pills. And by the way, almost without fail, every one of the cases that I can think of that we've looked at that involved an officer with some sort of prescription pill criminal charge, they all relate back to having been injured.
Yeah, and that's, I guess, that whole opioid addiction, because that's what leads to the heroin a lot of times, right?
Right. It's just the same thing as the general public. We're seeing that exact pattern with officers.
That's sad. I plan to have another professor, an addiction specialist, on to have an episode about chronic pain management and addiction and what's going on. So, okay. And then you talk about the corruption too. So you see abuse with the drugs for those 4 drugs that you mentioned: cocaine, marijuana, crack, and heroin. And then also the idea of the dirty cop and the distribution and the things that go on there. That's what you're talking about as well?
Yeah, we see a variety of different kinds of shakedowns that are drug-related. One of the biggest problems is drug-related shakedowns where an officer, a dirty officer, is actually stealing from somebody they stop in a traffic stop.
Okay.
And that happens all over the place, and it happens all over the place with Hispanic motorists, and it's really kind of a nasty stereotype where you've got these predator cops who are pulling over somebody because they believe that Hispanic person is a Mexican. And because they're Mexican, they're an illegal immigrant. And because they're an illegal immigrant, they're carrying a lot of cash because they don't have a bank account. And we can steal their cash. And it's really a strange thing. But we see this all over the country where we have rogue officers who are robbing Hispanic motorists. And by the way, almost all of them are not illegal immigrants, do not have a large amount of cash, and they're probably not Mexican.
Right. Okay, I got you. Yeah. Well, and it's the same thing, I guess, with the prostitutes and sex workers. The more vulnerable you appear, the more likely you are for the predator police to take advantage of that. And it's sad that it falls along race lines, but I mean, I guess it's just like basically, I guess your research, not basically, but it highlights what is going on in society just in the subsect of police officers, but they're just a reflection of a society. And I think it's important to remember that those officers live in our neighborhoods. They act, work, they have the same life experiences that we do. Right. And there's not much difference because they put on that blue or black uniform and carry that gun. They have the same
problems that we do. And some of these people, by the way, are people who've been friends of mine. And they've got to do the same thing that everybody else has to do to get in trouble, figure out how to move on with your life. And how to be productive again, those kinds of things. So, yeah, I think that's a good point, that what we're seeing is a real mirror image of what we see quite often in the general population, with some exceptions. We've got the gun, we got the badge, and we've got the occupational deviance kind of things that go along with all that. But these are people who shouldn't be getting arrested anyway. So
right.
I guess nobody should get arrested, but generally we certainly don't think this is a problem that we'd have to deal with. So the research goes on, and hopefully it's meaningful research that can make a difference.
It's certainly meaningful to me. I think our listenership, it'll be meaningful to them because, this data, it transcends race, gender, whatever, because we all live in these, 2,500 agencies. We all live and policed by these areas. So it's extremely important. Personally, I appreciate your research and what your team is doing, what you've done for these last 10 plus years. And I definitely thank you for coming on the show and your time today.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
What is good? I told y'all that was going to be a good one. Man, I hope y'all enjoyed that conversation as much as I did recording it. The topics that we covered, I think, shed a lot of light on, like I said on the show, it's a microcosm of what we experience in our everyday lives and as a normal society. But it's really important that the ones we hold to a higher standard, the ones that we call on to protect and serve, that we pay attention to what's happening with them, more so as a cautionary tale, really, so that they can do what they're supposed to do in the right way. So thanks again for everyone who listened. Please use the hashtag The Vocal Minority. Make sure you go right now, subscribe, leave a 5-star review and a rating on iTunes, repost and like on SoundCloud. Follow me on Twitter. We have a new show name now. It's now Vocal Report, @Vocal Report on Twitter. You can tweet us, get at me, anything you want, and then follow us on Facebook, facebook.com/The Vocal Minority Report. Once again, thanks a lot, and we'll holler at you next week. Peace.
This is Miles of the Miles Weekly Personal Finance Podcast. Check me out every week on iTunes, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts as I go over the basics of investing, small business, savings, and all things money. That's the Miles Weekly Personal Finance Podcast. And remember, invest wisely.
This has been a Vocal Neighbors production.